He was a farmer, but circumstances turned him into a soldier. When he received the command of the army, his demeanor changed, and he fled from the room. Despite facing defeat in most of his battles, he is still counted among the successful generals in history. Even when he received the news of becoming president, he was not pleased. We are narrating the story of George Washington, the founding father of the United States. In 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, lightning struck a house. The house's chimney caught fire, and a guest woman died. The owner of the house was afraid that this incident was a bad omen and that the child to be born would not be healthy. However, when on February 15, 1732, his son stepped into the world, all the mother's worries vanished, and the father, Augustine Washington, named the child George Washington. George's father was a large landowner involved in tobacco cultivation. During this time, the children of the wealthy often received education at home, and George Washington's education was also completed at home. By the age of 15, he had completed his education. When George Washington became a young man, traces of the elite class were evident in his personality. He dressed in the finest attire, learned dance, music, and the art of fencing. It was said that there was no better horse rider in all of Virginia than him. However, this young man also faced some challenges in his life. He had constant pain in his teeth, and he had to endure the extraction of each tooth one by one, spending a significant part of his life on wooden dentures. George Washington suffered from various diseases, including tuberculosis and malaria, which were often fatal during that time. However, George Washington recovered each time. He inherited Mount Vernon, a magnificent estate in Virginia, from his brother Lawrence, along with a considerable amount of land from his father. In Mount Vernon, Washington brought his bride Martha and the 2 children from her first marriage. It was here that he started his career as a surveyor. However, when his brother Lawrence died, Washington joined the militia because his brother was also an officer in the militia. It was right after his brother's death that George Washington found employment in the militia. When George Washington joined the militia, America was not yet a country as it is today. The majority of the territory was under British control. The responsibility of defending America rested with the British Army, and the American militia was also under its command. Washington, as a militia colonel under British command, fought against the French in the war. The war continued from 1756 to 1763, spanning 7 years. George Washington's duty was in the Pennsylvania region, where he, along with the British Army, worked to clear the area from French influence. In one battle, he found himself in the crossfire of enemy bullets, but narrowly escaped death. On another occasion, he had to put weapons into the hands of the French encircled. The building where this incident occurred has since been rebuilt. In 1763, when Britain won the war, George Washington retired from the militia, returned to Mount Vernon, and began cultivating his fields, where he employed his enslaved African American workers. Indeed, George Washington had around 300 enslaved African American workers. Although he did not approve of slavery and considered it unjust, he never freed any of his slaves. However, he made a provision in his will that all his slaves should be freed after his wife's death. Perhaps George Washington would never have returned to politics and military life if the political situation in America had not changed. Due to the 5 to 7 years of war, the British government was heavily in debt. To repay the debt, British Emperor George III imposed heavy taxes on American colonies. In 1767, Americans were ordered to pay taxes on paper, glass, lead, and tea. While the government withdrew most taxes in response to American protests, the tax on tea remained. This tax led to violent protests in America. On the night of December 16, 1773, in the city of Boston, American demonstrators, dressed as Native Americans, attacked 3 British ships. They threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This event is remembered in America as the Boston Tea Party. In retaliation, The British Army attacked the city and harassed ordinary people. After this incident, the American colonies decided to gain independence from British rule. Representatives of the colonies initiated conferences in Philadelphia. Since George Washington was a member of the Virginia Assembly, he represented Virginia at these conferences. The Conference of the Colonies Representatives was called the Continental Congress. On July 4, 1776, from the platform of this Congress, the 13 American colonies declared independence. George Washington also signed the Declaration of Independence. George Washington was chosen as the commander for the fight for freedom because no one in all of America had as much military experience as he did, meaning there was no other viable option beyond him. Therefore, Congress appointed George Washington as the commander of the American Regular Army. While George Washington accepted the command, his face turned pale, and in anxiety, he rushed out of the room. George Washington took charge of the army, but the war was not easy. Besides facing the enemy, he had to contend with the harshness of the weather. He had to cross dangerous rivers, and a simple mistake could lead his entire army into a trap. George Washington had fought some small battles during his service in the militia in Virginia, but in front of British colonels, he had very little knowledge of war. He acquired practical wisdom through reading some books and learning from his experiences. Nevertheless, he did not prove to be an effective commander. He directly led his army in 3 battles, winning only 1. Although he suffered defeats in 6, the major reason was not George Washington's weak military strategy, but the lack of resources and the deteriorating condition of the army. When George Washington received the army, it included untrained boys up to the age of 15. Many soldiers had only muskets or sticks in the name of weapons. Facing defeats repeatedly was not unusual for George Washington with this weak and untrained army. Whenever George Washington wrote to Congress, mentioning the conditions of the army, the response was, "Stop complaining." There came a time during the war when the American army reached the brink of destruction. In the winter of 1777, George Washington established his camp in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to provide some relief to his soldiers. He had 10,000 soldiers with him, but there was no arrangement in his camp to keep them warm. When the snowfall began, the firewood in the dense forests became so wet that it became extremely challenging to burn them. Food for the soldiers and fodder for the horses ran out. George Washington went to his soldiers to boost their morale, but this encouragement was not enough. By the time Washington took his army out of Valley Forge, more than half of his 11,000 soldiers were suffering from hunger, disease, and a cold. Valley Forge, where George Washington had staged a rebellion, has been given the status of a National Historical Park. The majority of the huts and other memorials in George Washington's camp have been rebuilt here. The headquarters of George Washington, where he used to hold meetings with his officers, has also been preserved. George Washington was still coping with the deteriorating condition of his army when in 1778 he received an ally. France started helping George Washington to avenge its defeat against Britain in 1763. A French general, Marquis de Lafayette, arrived in America a year earlier and was providing training to George Washington's army. Another former military general, Baron von Steuben, also assisted George Washington significantly. This person taught the American army to fight like a unit and explained how to stay steadfast on the battlefield despite enemy gunfire. After learning from the help of allies and overcoming some of his own failures, George Washington succeeded in significantly improving his army. By this time, although Britain seemed to be winning the war, and the American army was mostly facing defeats, in 1781, George Washington experienced an unexpected turn of events that completely changed the course of the war. At that time, the British Army commander, General Lord Cornwallis, led his 7,000 soldiers to Yorktown, Virginia, with the plan to transfer them to other locations in America. Lord Cornwallis was waiting there for the British Navy because British ships were supposed to move his army to other American posts. George Washington and his French allies besieged Yorktown by land and sea. The French Navy, by defeating the British fleet, also blocked Lord Cornwallis's escape route. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28, and thereafter, fierce battles occurred between the Allied and British forces around the fortress. In every battle, the Allies started winning, and when Lord Cornwallis saw no hope of help, he surrendered on October 17, 1781. 2 years later, in September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, bringing peace between Britain and America, making America an independent country. On November 25, 1783, George Washington entered New York City as a victor, although he did not stay there for long. As soon as news of the peace treaty reached him, he bid farewell to his officers and resigned from the command of the army. He returned to Mount Vernon and began living a retired life once again. However, this retirement did not last longer than a few years. It was felt in America that the country needed a strong leader who was respected by all. Therefore, in 1789, when elections were held in the light of America's Constitution, the chosen electors unanimously elected George Washington as the president. It is said that when George Washington learned that he had become the president, he was not happy. However, he had to accept this position for the sake of his country. On April 30, 1789, in front of thousands of Americans gathered outside Federal Hall in New York City, George Washington was taking the oath of office on the balcony of the City Hall. He said the following words: "I earnestly take this oath that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Since George Washington, every U.S. president has taken a similar oath in their inaugural ceremonies. George Washington served as the elected President of the United States twice, each term lasting 4 years. He held the presidency from 1789 to 1797. During this period, 2 events tarnished his reputation. The first was the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania in 1794. During the rebellion, insurgents opposed to a tax on whiskey captured tax collectors, humiliated government officials by tearing and feathering them, and staged a march in the city with a wooden effigy of Washington. Although the rebellion was quelled after the intervention of the militia, Washington became unpopular. Cartoons were published depicting Washington wrapping the Constitution around the rebellion and placing it in a bottle. Washington's reputation suffered another blow in 1795 when, in the same year, he promised under a treaty that America would repay its pre-independence debt to Britain before obtaining freedom. This treaty faced severe criticism from Congress and the media. False accusations were made, labeling Washington as a fake patriot and a deceitful person. Despite personal attacks, Washington upheld his responsibilities as president. Washington's retirement home, Mount Vernon, always held sentimental value for him. To ensure the capital of the United States was near his residence, Washington initiated the construction of a city named Washington, D.C., near Virginia. He had begun the construction of the White House for the president's residence. However, the White House was not completed before the end of Washington's second term. The second term of Washington's presidency ended in 1797. He chose not to run for a third term, setting a precedent for the 2-term limit that would later become a constitutional amendment. In his farewell address, he stated, "The 2 terms of a president are enough. Now, it is time to hand over the government to a new president." In 1797, George Washington retired for the 3rd and final time and returned to Mount Vernon. Despite having a peaceful retirement planned, he was soon called back into public service. On December 12, 1799, George Washington rode his horse through fields soaked in rain. He did not bother changing his wet clothes when he returned home. On December 14, suffering from a throat infection, he told his wife Martha, lying in bed. The individual in question checked their own pulse, and after a few moments, breathed their last. At the time of death, they were 67 years old. They were interred in a 4-walled structure at some distance from Mount Vernon. Similar to Abraham Lincoln, George Washington's religious beliefs also sparked controversy. He showed minimal interest in religion and rarely mentioned God and Jesus Christ in his writings. Unlike George Washington, who had no offspring, all of his affection was devoted to his numerous adopted children. Today, George Washington is revered as the founder of America. His birthday is celebrated on the third Monday of February, known as President's Day. On this day, government offices in America are closed and parades are held nationwide. Memorials and statues of George Washington are scattered throughout the United States. Near the White House, a minaret has also been constructed in Washington's memory. Prominent among the sculpted faces on the historic Mount Rushmore, which features 4 American leaders, including George Washington, is a testament to their enduring legacy.